Would you believe me if I told you that when Jesus was alive here on earth, He got thrown out of the church? I know what you're thinking. I know you're thinking the church was not established until after His death, burial, and resurrection. But when Jesus went to church, He went to like a synagogue, a Jewish synagogue. And it has been said, at least by one commentator, that in those days, they shut the door of the church on Jesus. They wanted to exclude Him from the temple or from the synagogue. Now, that was not the case early on. Speaking of the temple, you remember when Jesus got lost from His parents, when they came back to Jerusalem, they found Jesus in the temple. And there in Luke chapter 2, about verse 47, it says that He was sitting and He was listening and He was asking questions. And it says that the people in the temple were amazed, or they were astonished at what Jesus knew. Remember, He was only 12 years old. So that was not always the case, but as Jesus progressed and got into what we call His personal time of ministry, when He was an adult, in Matthew chapter 12, you read of an account. You read of an account where Jesus goes into the synagogue and He's asked about healing on the Sabbath. And essentially, in Mark chapter 12, down through verse 9, down through verse 15, you can read how the Jews started to plot against Jesus. And it says there in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 15 that He left the synagogue. He departed from the synagogue. And I think this was a turning point in the ministry of Jesus. Matter of fact, there's a practical lesson to learn from what Jesus did on this occasion. Jesus understood that you have to never change the message, but you have to always change the method. And Jesus knew that the message was always going to be the same. He never changed what He told people, but He determined it was a time for His ministry to change. So He left the synagogue, if you will, and He went to the streets. More technically, if you go over to Matthew chapter 13, the very next chapter, He went to the seashore. But He got out of the synagogue and He went into a new field of work. He went into a new area to do His work. And so He changed His approach. He changed His method. And that's the practical lesson I was mentioning a moment ago. We've got to always be willing to do that. Always preach the truth, but determine how's the best way to do it, the method that we do it. But I bring this to your attention, though, this morning, saying that Jesus got thrown out of the church, got thrown out of the synagogue, and He changed His method and He went out to the seashore, to bring you to understand a principle today that I think we sometimes forget. When Jesus went to the seashore, He told a parable. He told a parable that we call the parable of the sower. And you remember in the parable of the sower, there are three different occasions in the gospel accounts when this parable is mentioned. It's mentioned here in Matthew the 13th chapter, as I said just a moment ago. It's also found in Luke the 8th chapter, and it's also found in Mark the 4th chapter. It's in Mark chapter 4, though, that there is one statement, there is one thing that is included there in Mark chapter 4 that was not included in Luke 8 or Matthew 13. A few years ago, I was actually sitting in a Bible class, and someone pointed out something about Mark chapter 4's account that I have never considered, and it really brings a lot of attention to the power of this parable, the parable of the sower, because in Mark 4 and verse 13, Jesus said, "Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables?" And what this Bible school teacher pointed out that there is something fundamental. There is a key element to the parable of the sower that is helpful for us to understand all of the parables. And it's really helpful for us to understand the ministry that we do for Jesus. Because in the parable of the sower, there were three key ingredients. Number one, there was a sower. Matthew 13 starts out by saying a sower went out to sow. So there's a sower. The sower went out to sow seed. It's the second key ingredient. And the sower went out to sow seed on the soil, the third key ingredient. And of course, as you read the parable of the sower, you read about the different types of soil. which represent the different types of hearts or lives that the Word might encounter as the sower goes out to sow. And so there's something important to learn here, I think, in all of this that I want to bring your attention to this morning. Is something I think that we sometimes forget. And when we think about ministry, when we think about the process of our part in being involved in ministry, and it's something that we forget very often that is a key ingredient to successful ministry, and that's the name of our lesson today, and that is, it's God who actually gives the increase. I want to tell you why it's important for us to understand that. Over in the scripture that was read just a moment ago in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and if you just want to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, that's where we're going to really spend the rest of our time this morning. In that particular passage, there is a key statement that is made by the Apostle Paul, and that's where we're going to focus all of our attention. It's right there in verse 6 where Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Here's what we sometimes forget in ministry. And I'm not talking about the kind of ministry that your preacher does, or your youth minister, or your associate minister, or even, ministry leaders, elders, deacons. I'm talking about the type of ministry that everybody should be doing. We're talking about us this morning. We're talking about the church this morning, from the front row here to the upper row in the balcony. We're talking about everybody, okay? And there's something we sometimes forget. It's that God is the one who gives the increase. We've got to be involved in it. Paul points out here, and I think it's needful for us to remind everyone. Paul points out that conversion isn't solely about the messenger. I think this is the thing that we often get hung up on. I think we sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that I can't do this because it's all on me. But Paul makes the point in verse 7 that says, so then neither he who plants is anything. A looser translation, a paraphrase, if you will, of that says, the person who does the planting or watering isn't very important. And so what we do need to remember then is that it's not all on us in the work of ministry. The second thing we need to remember is that we sometimes forget where the true power is. It's not in our cleverness. It's not in our ability to say words eloquently or not. The power, the true power of ministry and conversion is in the Word. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. And then another thing we often forget. We forget that, as this verse says, that there needs to be some watering that takes place in the process. And then, of course, the final thing in these preliminary thoughts this morning that we've got to remember and that we sometimes forget is God is involved in this process. Let's do not leave God out of the process. So, here's what we're going to do. About as simple of a lesson as you can find. We're going to take this verse and we're going to go line by line and we're going to talk about ministry. We're going to talk about what we can do in ministry, how we can be involved in it. From, if you will, the least of us to the greatest. There's something for all of us to do. It's not just one person's job here. It's not just a handful of people's job here. It's something all of us can do. Don't be intimidated by it. Don't think that you can't be a part of it, because I hope today you'll be able to see that you can be a part of that. So let's go line by line. First of all, and if you've got, an outline in the bulletin, you'll just be able to fill this in as we go along. The first thing we're going to concentrate on is how Paul says, I planted. If you read the parable of the sower, it says a sower went out to sow. So in the process of evangelism, there has to be someone who does some sowing of the seed. And I think when Jesus gave the Great Commission, He probably had this imagery in His mind. When He said, go to all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, that He must have been thinking about the parable that He had told, about the parable of the sower. It takes someone who's willing to spread the word. Now, you maybe have been told, and it's right, as far as I understand it, that the idea of going, as it's translated in our English translations, should actually be understood as having gone. See, when we talk about ministry, a lot of times we concentrate on the going. You've got to go. But literally, as I understand it, the best translation of this verse is having gone. In other words, Jesus assumed we would be doing this. Jesus assumed that His people would be going out and talking to others about Him. And so, maybe we're lacking initiative to get up and go do the going. And if so, then get up and go do the going. But the real key here, though, is on the planning. It's not on the going, because you ought to be doing that. It's on the planning. Remember, this is your job. This is what we do. We sow. We sow the seed. And a farmer doesn't just go out and sow seed once every now and again. This is what he does all the time. This is his job. I know he does it seasonally, obviously, but he never sows and then stops sowing for 2 or 3 or 10 years. That's not the way it works. This is what he does. He does it all the time. And so the point of emphasis is not on the going so much as the doing. Paul says, I planted. You can see the urgency of Paul in all this. In Acts chapter 9, we know that he is converted to the cause of Christ. And immediately after his conversion, after his baptism, the text literally says immediately, Acts 9:20, he preached Christ in the synagogues. So he understood the urgency of, even as a new Christian, if you will, getting involved in this process. And as we've studied in the book of Acts, Paul not only went on one missionary journey, he went on not 2 missionary journeys, but 3 missionary journeys. And it's no wonder that he told the church at Rome, I am ready to preach the gospel. It's because not that he had to motivate himself to go. That's what he was on his way the whole time. But as he went about, he shared the gospel. He said, I planted. And so, yes, there are those who need to do this. But what you need to understand is it's not something that you have to do publicly. It's not something you have to do eloquently. It can be done privately. It can be done in common conversation. You think about what we know how to talk about. You think about what we're willing to talk about. Anybody talked about football in the last 24 hours? We can talk about football. We can talk about the weather. We can talk about politics. We can talk about our work. We can talk about our children. We can talk about our recreational activities. We talk about those kind of things all the time. There's nothing wrong with talking about those things. I'd encourage you to talk about those things. What we need to do is, as we're going and talking about those things, we need to bring Jesus into the conversation. I mean, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but do we sometimes forget that that is what evangelism really is? It's about bringing Jesus into the conversation. It's about talking about Jesus. And yeah, there comes a point, perhaps, when someone needs to sit down with an open Bible with someone who's not a Christian, and we need to go over some verses and some principles. But ministry, though, involves more than just that. It's about just bringing Jesus into the conversation. So as you go, I don't mean as you go on a mission trip. I mean as you go about, as you walk about, as you talk about, bring Jesus into the conversation. You can do that. Everybody can do that. Paul said, I planted. But then he said, Apollos watered. How many times have you read this verse here in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6? And you've just glanced right over what it says about Apollos. Paul said, I planted, but Apollos watered. I want to ask you a question. How important is it for a seed to be watered? Now, some of you have gardens. Some of you perhaps plant flowers. How important is it when you plant something to later water that seed? Would you not say that 100% of the time, if that seed that you plant doesn't get watered in the right amount of time or the right amount of consistency, that plant will fail? Would you not agree? We understand that. I mean, you don't have to have an agriculture degree to understand that if you plant a seed, it's going to take some watering for that seed to sprout and for it to grow. See, Apollos is the one who comes along and does some watering. Now Apollos is a very fascinating biblical character. We studied about him from Acts chapter 18 not too long ago in our studies on the book of Acts on Sunday nights. But here's what we know about Apollos from Acts chapter 18. Other than the fact that he appears in the New Testament just 10 times, we know that he was very likely a very educated person because he was from Alexandria, and that's where all the scholars lived in those days. We know he was an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures. We know verse 25 says that he was fervent in the Spirit. He was motivated. And we know also that it says he taught accurately, but here's the one flaw he had. He only knew the baptism of John, and that's why Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and explained more accurately the Word of God to him. And we believe he got that right. He started preaching baptism the way it should have been preached. Obviously, he continued to mature through that teaching. And Paul says here in our text, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 5, that both he and Apollos were ministers through whom the Corinthians believed. Think about that for just a moment. Apollos was a minister. Yet he did the watering. He didn't do the initial teaching. He did the watering. But those Corinthians would have never believed, and that means they believed and obeyed the gospel. You understand that they had to do more than just believe in Jesus. They had to believe and obey. The idea, though, is it took someone to preach the word, to plant the seed. It took someone to water the seed. And Apollos was the one to do that. Isn't it interesting? Have you ever thought about this? That Apollos is described, we assume he's an educated man. He's described as an eloquent man. And yet he's the one that does the watering. Didn't Paul one time say that he didn't speak eloquently? And yet he's the one that does the planting? Isn't that interesting? Maybe sometimes we think we need to get the most gifted person to do the planting. But there needs to be somebody to come along, maybe with the right choice of words, to do the watering. You know something you can do? You can overwater something, can you not? You can drown the seed. It'll rot in the ground if it gets too wet. So sometimes you hear about, cotton farmers or wheat farmers, and they'll bemoan when they don't get any water and the seed won't sprout, but they'll also bemoan when they get too much water. Be careful not to overwater something. Now, I know that's typically not our problem, but it's just a word of caution. But here's what I want to remind you of today. See, as we go about talking about football and family and school, work, the weather, whatever we're talking about, as we're living our life, bring Jesus into the conversation. Paul said, I planted. And then as you go about doing all those things, living your life, do some watering. Talk to someone that you know needs to hear an encouraging word. Maybe they've been taught some in the past, but they're not yet a believer. Or maybe they are, like in the parable of the sower, they are a believer and they've obeyed the gospel, but they're weak and they need encouragement. It's like that little plant that's starting to grow and then it gets dry. And you know what they need? They need some water. They need somebody to water. Paul says, now he who plants and he who waters are one. That work is just as important. And do you remember in Luke's account how it's put in Luke 8 and verse 6? Some of the seed that fell on the rock, it says, as soon as it sprang up, it withered away. You remember why it withered away? Because it lacked moisture. What you could do, not necessarily as a sower of the seed, but a waterer of the seed, is equally as powerful and important in ministry. Anybody here can do this. Anybody can. You can be a part of this process. Let's don't wait for 1 or 2 people or 8 or 10 people to do it. Everybody can do it. And then here's the whole point of this lesson that I want to remind you of, and that is God's the one who does the saving. God is the one who brings the harvest. God gave the increase. I'll remind you again that Paul downplays the role of the human teacher in this process. Verse 5, who is Paul? Who is Apollos? But ministers. Verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. Verse 7, so then neither he who plants is anything, or he who waters, but God gives the increase. I want to remind you today that church growth isn't just about your talent or my talent. We've got to be involved in it, but it's about God. We are God's fellow workers. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 9. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 1. We are workers together with God. You can be involved in the greatest work in the world, and you can have God working with you in evangelism and in ministry. I would remind you that we've got to be patient. Patience is required. James 5 and verse 7 says, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. The seed's got to be planted. The seed's got to be watered. But then there's some time that's got to go by. Some patience has got to be employed. And when we do what we're supposed to do, here's what I want to leave you with today. God will do what He's supposed to do. God will do what He's supposed to do. If we plant and if we water, God will give the increase. I read this. I'll share it with you as we close. There was an agricultural school in Iowa who did this study, a study on what it took to produce 100 bushels of corn from 1 acre of land. This is what they determined. You needed 4 million pounds of water. You needed 6,800 pounds of oxygen, 5,200 pounds of carbon, 160 pounds of nitrogen, 125 pounds of potassium, and 75 pounds of yellow sulfur. And they said in addition to all of that, in addition even to that 4 million pounds of water, there still needed to be some God-given water. There needed to be some God-given sunshine. And they determined that although the farmer would labor many, many hours in the process of bringing 100 bushels of corn from 1 acre of land, they determined that his part was only 5%. The rest of it was the process of God. That's amazing. That's what ministry is. We've got a part. Plant, water, and then be patient and allow God to give the increase. We hope that you're a part of God's family today. We want to give you the opportunity, if you're not, to become a member of His church, a child in His family. The parable of the sower is applicable to what we've talked about today. The sower went out to sow. He sowed seed, and the seed fell on ground. What kind of heart do you have? Some of the ground the seed fell upon did not take the seed well. It did not receive the seed well. But the one soil that received the seed and it gave fruit was the good soil. You probably wouldn't be here this morning if you didn't have a good heart. And so today, if you're not a Christian, we want to encourage you to receive the seed, to receive the Word, and act upon it. Believe it. Obey it. It involves your belief in Jesus, your repentance from sin, confession before men, and baptism into water and into Jesus for the forgiveness of your sin. We'd assist you today, gladly so, in becoming a New Testament Christian. We want to give you that opportunity. Maybe as a Christian, you haven't been a part of the process the way you know you need to. And if it's something public that you want to share with us, if you want the prayers of the church, if you want to turn a corner, so to speak, turn over a new leaf, start afresh, that's why we're here. We'd gladly pray with you, and we want to encourage you. So if you need to respond today, we encourage you to do it right now as we stand.